Okay, everyone. We are in chapter 29, and this is not going to be a long lecture. You actually get a little bit of a relief um, in this chapter, but we are going to discuss a new aspect of the participle. Um, it's essentially just a new aspect of the form of the participle that you've already learned. So let's look at some introductory materials here. So what you've been learning up to this point in terms of participles is the adverbial aspects of the participle. Well, this chapter, chapter 29, is about the adjectival aspect of the participle. So there are no new forms that you have to learn for this chapter. You've already learned them, or if you don't feel like you have a great handle on parsing the participles, you have an extra week here to continue to work with that form and get more accustomed to recognizing and translating the participle. So the participle can act like a verbal adjective. So it can modify a noun, but it can also act like a noun. And I want you at this point to pause this video, pause this lecture. I want you to go back to chapter 9, particularly sections 9.2 and 9.3. And I want you to reread those. If you have to, go back into the playlist on YouTube, find the chapter on adjectives, and rewatch that lecture because it's been a minute since you had to learn about attributive or substantive adjectives, so the refresher might be worth your time. But the participle, when it's adjectival, when it's acting like an adjective, just like an adjective, can be either attributive or substantive. And I just want to point out, here's what you're doing in this chapter. You've been working with participles when they act in the adverbial case or adverbial, not tense, but the structure, the when it comes to translating, right? So all of those same forms that you learned, you're now going to be, when you go through the workbook, you're going to be going through sentences that have those same words with those same endings. Everything's going to look the same as everything you've been translating. But the element that's being added in this chapter is that you're not just going to pull the trigger on translating the participles that you see as adverbial. You now have to start asking yourself questions, and we're going to go through 7 questions at the end of this lecture that's going to help you with your participle translations. But I've been telling you up to this point that participles are so interesting because what participles offer you is there's a gray area because generally speaking, not fully, but generally speaking, up to this point, up to participles, when you had a sentence to translate, it's pretty simple to translate each word individually or maybe each prepositional phrase. And although you weren't getting a word for word, you could generally pick out the word in a sentence and translate it. And what you're left with is, for the most part, an English sentence, right? But now you get to participles, and you've got participles and participle phrases. You got participles that can act like an adverb. You got participles that can act like an adjective, or can also function like a noun. And so when we started this journey on participles, I said, okay, let's just add ing and kind of start making our way through translating participles until we kind of feel comfortable with it. Well, now we've reached a point with participles that when you find a participle in a sentence, it could be adverbial, it could be adjectival, there could be an article, there could not be an article. And that's going to help you identify it. And you're going to have to answer a series of questions every time you see a participle now to determine the right translation. And within that, what you're going to find is there's some variability with how you translate. Sometimes you're going to say it. So sometimes you're going to say who. Sometimes you're going to say he or she. Right? It's going to depend on the context. It's going to depend on the words that are modified. If something is in the neuter, you're going to use it. Essentially, and I've said this a couple of times before already in previous lectures, is that you have this Greek sentence that you're trying to translate into English. The translation is only accurate if the sentence makes sense in English. And it's particularly hard, not hard, they're just extra steps you have to go through. It's particularly challenging with participles because now what you are forced to do as the translator is you're forced to make a decision about whether you use a he, a she, a it, a who's, a who. Like it's really in those participles. It's really interesting. It's really in the participles that you find a lot of variations in translation because a lot of what you're going to do in translation is going to be left up to you. So when it comes to adjectival participles, they're either going to be attributive or substantive. And you're going to translate them differently based on whether they're attributive or substantive. That's why I want you to stop the video, go back to chapter 9, read through it, go back to particularly 9.2 and 9.3 and get accustomed to it. So when you're translating adverbial participles, you're going to use words like while, after, because, based on translation. When it's an attributive, so we're trying to determine whether the word is attributive or substantive, right? So an attributive adjectival participle, it will modify a noun or pronoun, and it will agree in case, number, and gender. When you come across an attributive adjectival participle, you're generally speaking going to just translate it by adding ing to the form. So, for instance, the attributive adjectival participle of Lego, I say, would be saying, right? Just context, it might not be saying, it might be something else, but you're just going to add ing to the form. So if it's attributive, when it comes to translating it, you're just going to add the ing. Substantive, it's going to function as a noun. Its case is going to be determined by its function in the sentence. The number and gender is going to be determined by what it's representing. You're going to translate substantive or substantival participles by inserting extra words, one, he, she, or it, they, whose, etc. You're going to have flexibility in how you do that as long as it makes a coherent English sentence. So what you want to do is you want to try to get as close to the intent of the Greek as possible. That's why if you are translating a substantive participle and it's functioning as a noun in a sentence, and the proper translation would be it, and you say he, then that's going to be incorrect. Because what you want to do is you want to get as close to the intent of the Greek as possible, right? I say this a lot in my theology classes, but the difference between what we're doing here at Elam, what you're doing here at school, and maybe a Bible study that you may attend at your church, the difference is in this program and in formal theological training, you're nitpicking things. Because what your job is as the theologian is to nitpick concepts, ideas, and words. Because what your job as a theologian is to accurately portray as closely as possible the intent of the New Testament author or Old Testament, but in this case, because it's Greek, New Testament. So when you're forming your sentences, I want you to keep that in mind. And I want you to keep that in mind because I want you to develop a habit of doing that. I want you to develop a habit of finding yourself in a position where you correct people and say, well, it wouldn't be he, it'd be it, because that's neuter. Right? That's what I want you to do, because that's what your job is. Your job is to understand this and to nitpick it. Right? So how do we know if, and this is really the tough part. And by the way, this whole section on a whether a participle is attributive or substantive, it'd be really difficult for me to elaborate too much more than what Dr. Mounce does. So I would encourage you, pages 330, really through the middle of 332, read through that, and it's gonna really clarify some of the stuff I said on the previous two slides. I didn't spend a lot of time on it because most of it can be covered in chapter 9, right? And so there's no need for me to reinvent the wheel. You've already learned it once, so really this is just a review. So that's why I didn't dig too deep into the differences between attributive or substantive. But the big question that you're going to have to ask yourself when it comes to participles is it an adverbial or an adjectival participle? Because that's really going to determine how you translate it. So I've already said that there's no difference in form between adverbial or adjectival. All of the participles that you've been learning and all the participles that you've been translating them as adverbial participles. Well, now you're going to take those same words, form the same way, and you're going to have to determine whether or not you translate them as adverbial or adjectival. But there are a couple of clues that are going to help you know the difference. So the first clue is that if there is no article preceding the participle, there's a pretty good chance that's adverbial. You should try translating it as adverbial if there's no article, because an adverbial participle never has an article, right? So start there. An adjectival participle usually has an article. So if there is an article that precedes the participle, then that is going to be adjectival. If there is no article, it's probably going to be adverbial, but you need to translate it first. If you translate it as adverbial and you're left with, that doesn't make any sense. Well, now you translate it as adjectival and see if it makes sense. The only way to do it is to try both. If there's no article present, is to try both, see which one makes sense. But the presence of an article, if there is an article that precedes the participle, that's going to be adjectival. It's going to be easy to spot. If there's no article, then you need to start translating to see which one fits. Let's see. All right. So we're going to leave adjectival participles. That's it. That's all you need to know. You've already learned the form. You've already learned adjectives. So now what you need to know primarily is how to translate it, right? Article's present, adjectival. No article, translate as adverbial first. That doesn't make sense. Translate it as adjectival. Easy peasy, right? But when it comes to participles in general, you're reading along and you see a participle. Dr. Mounce has identified 7 questions, sort of a workflow, like I don't know the word I'm looking for, like a way of working that will help you translate it correctly every time. And these can be found on page 334. So you're reading along, you see a participle. First question you ask yourself, is it adverbial or adjectival? Presence of an article is going to help you, right? What word is it modifying? What word does it agree with in case, number, and gender, right? If it's adjectival, is it attributive or substantive? And you're going to translate based on the guidelines for how to translate adverbial or adjectival. That is reflected. You can look here on page 334. You can see number 4. I don't know if I wrote that correctly or not, but essentially, if it's adverbial, you're going to translate based on guidelines for how to translate adverbial. If you find it as adjectival, then you're going to translate it based on whether it's attributive or substantive. So you're just going to translate based on those guidelines. Question number 5, is it aorist or is it perfective or imperfective, right? What voice is it in? Active, middle, or passive? That's going to help you with translation. And what's the word's meaning? The verb that you're translating. What is the definition of the verb that you're trying to translate? And if you'll find yourself in the beginning, when you're going through the workbook, if you'll ask yourself these 7 questions, it's going to be slow at first. You're going to have the 7 questions pulled up next to you, and you're going to see a participle, and you're going to say, okay, question 1. What is question 1? Is it adverbial or adjectival? I don't remember. Oh, wait a minute. I think an adjective has an article. Okay, and it's going to be slow. But as you work through these, you'll get faster at it, and it'll almost be intuitive. Some of this 5, 6, and 7 is almost intuitive at this point because you've been looking at these for almost 2 semesters now. So that is all the grammar that you have for this chapter. I've got a few new vocabulary words. Let's take a look at our vocabulary words for this week. Dexami, I take, I receive. Dokeo, I think, I seem. Again, pick a translation and run with it. Esteo, I eat. Pempo, I send. And fetro, I carry, I bear, I produce. Okay, gang, that is chapter 29. That is adverbial participles. Have fun with your translations. It should be a little easier this week because you've already mostly learned those paradigms and those parsing. And stick with it. You're almost there.